Good day. One of the questions that were most asked around our current politics from our clients is the question of what's happening to expropriation without compensation, and how will it affect my property, my house, my farm? Should I still invest in property? That's one of the 5 areas. Let's look at the details of that. One must distinguish between 2 processes that are currently playing off in Parliament. The one is an attempt to change Section 25 of the Constitution, the so-called property clause. The second one is an expropriation bill, which is an ordinary bill of Parliament that is also making its way through the parliamentary processes. As far as the amendment to the Constitution is concerned, I think the EFF has recently, last week, played right into Mr. Ramaphosa's hands by declaring that they will never vote for an amendment which does not provide for all the land in South Africa to be held in the ownership of the state. They call it custodianship. Now, this is a big difference between the position of the ANC and the position of the EFF. The ANC believes in a range of private titles, freehold title as we know it, title held by in traditional authorities by the chiefs, title held by women in certain areas, and so on. There's a range of private titles in South Africa, and the ANC believe that should be maintained, and it must be extended to the people who currently do not have title. Now, the reality is, as long as the ANC does not vote for the amendment, then the ANC will probably not muster the 2/3 majority needed to change the Constitution. In fact, I shouldn't use the word probably, then they cannot do so. Even if some of the smaller parties come to the support of the ANC and the support of an amendment, they will still not be able to muster 2/3 and the constitutional change will not take place. Now, the EFF can, of course, change position. A week in politics is a very long time. But Julius Malema committed himself fairly unambiguously and fairly strongly in Parliament, in a public forum, to the EFF's position, and I can't see them changing that. I also can't see the ANC changing its position. There's a long history to its position, and although there are some members who may be willing to go with the EFF proposal, the party as such will not do it. So that then leaves us with the expropriation bill. And what does the expropriation bill say and do? Now, the first thing is the bill, because it's an ordinary bill of Parliament, must be in line with the Constitution and is subject to the Constitution. It cannot contain anything outside Section 25 and, of course, the rest of the Constitution. And what the Constitution determines or says is that both process and price, the 2 Ps, must be just and equitable. And over the last quarter of a century, a lot of court cases have been heard on this matter, and we've got quite clear guidelines on what is meant by just and equitable, what is a just and equitable process, what is a just and equitable price. So we're not in legal uncertainty here. Where the parties cannot agree on either the price or the process on what is just and equitable, then they have to go to court. And the court has got the final say. That's the current architecture of the Constitution. Now, what the bill does is to basically set out a long process, which I think is fair and just, gives a lot of ample opportunity, more than current legislation, to landowners to protect their interest or at least keep them informed. But in clause 12 of the bill, it lists a number of circumstances where a just and equitable price would be nil-rand compensation. And I'll show you the details of that just now, and you can make up your own mind. I expect this bill to pass parliamentary muster, to pass 50%. It may or may not be challenged in Constitutional Court, I don't know. And the minister responsible for it, Patricia de Lille, is currently working on getting it through the parliamentary process. It's important to note that when Minister de Lille published this bill in October last year, within a week, Ace Magashula, in a meeting in KwaZulu-Natal, said that as far as he was concerned, speaking as Secretary General of the ANC, the bill meets the requirements of the ANC's resolution on this matter. Now, of course, Mr. Magashula can change his mind, but he's on record as having said that in October in KZN. So what did I take from this slide is that Mr. Ramaphosa has balanced a very emotional and a very sensitive political issue quite cleverly with the needs of the Constitution and with the needs of the market. And I think, I can't speak for him, he will probably be relieved if we don't have to do a change of the Constitution and can just do the expropriation bill. What then are the details of Clause 12 where no rand compensation is possible? Again, Clause 12.3 reiterates the point that the process and the price must be just and equitable. That is the issue before you can arrive at a no rand compensation. And the first instances where land is not being used. The land is not being developed, or there are no plans to develop it, and the land is also not being used to generate an income. It's merely being held as a kind of a hedge against inflation, I would say. Then it is possible for that land to qualify. Of course, it must still meet the requirements of just and equitable, and to qualify for no rand compensation. Where an organ of state, in other words, an SOE or a municipality or a provincial government, hold land which is not necessary for the current core function of that state-owned entity, then it can also be expropriated at no rand compensation. So in a state, the state is actually sort of taking property from itself, so to speak, if you look at it broadly. Where the owner of land has abandoned the land and is exercising no control over it. Now, some of you will remember that Herman Mashaba, when he was the mayor of Johannesburg, he took some abandoned buildings in the CBD of Johannesburg and took ownership of it on behalf of the municipality. That would classically be a case where this clause will apply. Then there's a rather obscure provision that when the market value of the land, the current market value, is either equivalent to or less than money that the state has already put into the land, then the state can pay no rand compensation. I've tried to work out what kind of practical example that can be, and the best I can come up with is Nkandla. Clearly, the market value can never be 246 million rand, and in that case, you can expropriate without paying compensation, or by paying no rand compensation. Or where the property concerned poses as health, safety, or physical risk to other people, then it can also be expropriated at no rand. If I look at this list of examples here in Clause 12.3, then my so what would be that I don't think my house or your farm or your beach house is in danger. I think these examples are very constrained, they're very restricted, and in any case, they're still subject to just and equitable. Precisely what the Constitution at the moment determines. And I don't feel threatened by this at all. But I leave it for you to draw your own conclusions on it. The second issue on which we got quite a lot of questions is the political position of Mr. Ramaphosa. Will he survive? How long will he rule? And isn't he a case of a key man risk? And the answer is yes, he certainly is a key risk as far as a key person is concerned. But we must remember he still has 8 years to go of his term in office. He will no doubt get a second term, certainly as things stand today. And in 8 years' time, you can shape the values of a body politic quite a lot. Think of how much negative shaping Mr. Zuma has done. Well, the opposite is also possible, even if a bit harder. Mr. Ramaphosa is working very hard to clean up corruption, to build a better revenue service, to build a better prosecuting authority, to build a stronger SIU, and so on. So I think in the 8 years left, we can see quite a shift, and we're already seeing it in the values of our body politic. And of course, the further that shift, the less the key man risk. People asked when we will know who will succeed him and when will we know that. And I think the answer is by 2027, when the ANC has their elective conference at the end of Mr. Ramaphosa's term. That is when the successor will emerge, and we'll have quite a good idea who to go for. At this stage, I think it's really far too early to pronounce on that. How strong is Mr. Ramaphosa's position? And I just want to counter that question with a counter question. After the NEC meeting of 26 March, where it was unanimously agreed that the step-aside rule will be adopted and applied through the ANC, and since 26 March, we've seen a large number of people stepping down. Is that really still an indication that Mr. Ramaphosa is not strong or not in charge? He's outwitted every single opponent that he had in the ANC. He outwitted Mr. Zuma and took power from Mr. Zuma before the end of Zuma's term. He outwitted clearly Ace Magashula. Ace is now in court and trying to fight back. Let's see what the courts say. He's outwitted Julius Malema also on the land expropriation story, which started off as an EFF campaign, an EFF label, and now the EFF is voting against it. So I think it's quite clear that the man is a superb strategist, and he's outfoxed his opponents inside the party. Some readers asked, will the ANC ever really go after its own? And I think, again, there are the examples. Ace Magashula, where is he? The former Premier of Northwest, Zuma's strongman, a force in our politics, Supramamo Bello, where is he? Suspended from the ANC for 5 years, kicked out of a meeting in Parliament precisely because he's supposed to be on step aside. And if he step aside, he can't attend the meetings. And he was excluded. The former mayor of eThekwini, Zandile Gumede, where is she? Similar story. And then, very interesting, the deputy chairman of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, Mike Maboyakala. Where is Mike? Big supporter of Mr. Ramaphosa right from the beginning. He chose Ramaphosa and he climbed in behind his campaign. Yet he has stepped aside as well. So really, I don't think there's a question that the ANC will go after people who have been charged in court. That is the principle, and it's a big change from what we had in the past, even in the time of Mr. Mandela and Mr. Mbeki. Some people ask, some of our clients have asked, can the positive trends that Mr. Ramaphosa has initiated last? And there are two big trends. The one is the action that he took on cleaning up the civil places like SARS and the NPA and strengthening them and allowing them to take anti-corruption action and charge people. I think clearly the evidence speaks for itself. In August 2019 and then again in August 2020, I gave you an update on the work that has been done on the anti-corruption front. And I must tell you that work has not stopped. It is just getting more and more. We're keeping a full database, proprietary database of that, and I will in July, August this year update you again. But that crusade is gaining traction. There's no question about it. It's getting stronger. As far as the economy goes, Mr. Ramaphosa has committed himself and his government very, very unequivocally to structural reform. And structural reform is probably the most difficult political process to follow when it comes to the economy. And yet they're doing it. And the evidence is slowly beginning to come through. So I have no doubt that those two things, the anti-corruption crusade and structural reform in our economy, will carry on. And in that sense, in the 8 years that Mr. Ramaphosa is around, he can still achieve an enormous amount. So for me, the so what on this slide is simply to talk about the small margin with which Mr. Ramaphosa was elected 3.5 years ago in 2017 at Nasrec is really an outdated concept. Yes, he was elected by a small margin, but if you look at this slide, I think it's quite clear that that margin no longer applies. That is for me the big thing that I take away from this area of concern. Then the third area on which we got questions was politics in general, not just Mr. Ramaphosa, and then of course the October local government elections. And particularly, will Mr. Zuma make a comeback? Will the RDT faction in the ANC, Ace Magashula and Karl Nehaus and Tony Yengeni and those people, will they team up with Mr. Zuma and form a political party? Look, let me say, the ANC is going to crush Ace Magashula if the courts do not protect him. As you know, Mr. Magashula has gone to the courts and he's asked for protection against the step-aside rule. I don't think he will get it, but you never know what the court will decide. And if the courts don't protect him, he's finished with the ANC. There's no question about that. They will eject him and they will crush him. Will he then leave? Well, he will have to leave, but will he then form a party? That we will have to see. My own view is that I think it will be a first prize if all these people that I've mentioned, the RDT faction, if they go out and start a political party. It can spur a realignment of our politics. It will help to cleanse the ANC to some extent. It will not be a bad development. But at this stage, we'll have to wait and see how our politics develop. Now, when we talk about the EFF, it's important to bear in mind what their track record is like. In their first elections in 2014, parliamentary elections, they did quite well. They got 6.5% of the vote, 6.35. 2 years later, in the local government elections of 2016, they got 8.25%. It's reasonable growth. And then in the 2019 national elections, they went up to almost 11%. Now, some people are concerned about can they get 25%? Can they, like one of you said, be like Hitler, who got 37% before he took over power in Germany in the 1930s? Look, for a political party to double its support, to go from 11 to 22 is a major move and a significant achievement. At the moment, we don't see evidence of that in by-election results. In fact, if we look at by-election results, with the exception of the south of KZN, the EFF looks as if it is stagnated. The IFP, for example, is showing more progress in by-elections than what the EFF does. I think the majority of South Africans are just not into the kind of rhetoric and behavior and bullying attitude that Mr. Malema displays. And that's before the ongoing torture, the drip of VBS water, which is helping to undermine the EFF. My own view is also that I don't think there's room in our politics for two red parties, a red party from the ANC and the EFF itself. They will fight one another quite vociferously. So I'm not fearful of the EFF. Could of course change dramatically in the future elections, but that is where we stand now in the middle of the year. As far as the other big opposition party, the DA, goes, I think it's fair to say that they are unlikely to repeat the 27% that they got in the last local government elections 5 years ago in 2016, nor do I think they will repeat the almost 21% that they got in the national elections in 2019. And that leaves a lot of scope for other political parties to come in. My own view about the October elections is I think you will see 50% plus for the ANC, then less for EFF and the DA, and then a plethora of smaller parties and ratepayers associations who will come in and share the rest of the vote. But let's see, October will be an interesting month. Excuse me, an area of particular concern for people is local government. And indeed, the position is quite terrible. To use a word that Mr. Mboweni used in Parliament when he described it, it's lamentable. And I don't think one can improve on that. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The one is the structural design that we have. Think of China. In China, the mayors of towns, even the leaders of provinces, get elected from Beijing. They report to Beijing and they get promoted or demoted by Beijing. It's a highly centralized system. South Africa is highly decentralized. Here, every community chooses their own councillors, they choose their own mayors, they choose their own exco's. And that independence almost of local government is enshrined in our constitution. It is a completely different design than what we had, than what we have, for example, in China. And so it is very possible, and it happens in many, many cases, that some kind of a local power clique takes over. Then they run the town, they have the power, and you can't really get rid of them. And once they are in power, then I think Lord Acton's old rule of 120 years ago kicks in. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that's where we are to a large extent with local government in South Africa. Now, the interesting thing so far is that political parties have failed to make hay of this political failure by many councillors. The only exception to that is really the IFP, who've succeeded in taking some town councils in the rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal away from the ANC. But that's about the only one. So you have, in a sense, a void. Councils are not functioning well. The political process is not throwing up an alternative. So there's a rising anger and a rising resentment and an unhappiness that is filling that void. And so other solutions are busy developing. And that is an interesting area to take note of. In Kroonstad, in the Free State, in Mamelodi, in Senegal, Coligny, Alexandra, Tembisa, townships around Johannesburg, in my favorite Vicksburg, in the Eastern Free State, in all these little towns, citizens are beginning to come together to clean up the place, to fix the waterworks, to fix the sanitation, to fix the roads. Why Vicksburg is my favorite. There, the local taxi association and the farmers of the district got together. The one group brought their taxis, the other group brought their tractors and trucks, and they blockaded the roads in the Eastern Free State. Within 24 hours, the MEC for roads in the Free State was in Vicksburg, talking there. Within 48 hours, they had meetings with the chief engineer of the Free State, and the roads are being fixed. And what is interesting for me in Vicksburg, the minute you brought the taxis and the farmers together, there was action. But more than that, when they then elected a crisis committee to liaise further with the Free State government, the taxi bosses said, we are quite happy that there are only white people on this committee. They will do good work. We support them. And now the Free State government is dealing with this liaison committee. So you're going to see more and more of this kind of thing. Eskom is trying a new delivery model in the Eastern Free State, delivering electricity, but getting paid directly by the electricity consumers, so that the power to the town is not cut off, but money is paid for electricity delivered. We'll see how these models develop and expand over time. What's also happening is that these actions by local citizens, local ratepayers, enjoys strong backing by the courts. In Koster, for example, in Northwest, in Swartruggens, the court has gone as far as saying that the waterworks and the sanitation works in those municipalities must be handed over to the Ratepayers Association, who fixed it and restored the water supply and restored sanitation services. After a period, of course, they had to give it back to the council. It cannot stay with the ratepayers forever, but there was certainly a massive improvement in service delivery. In Vryburg, in the Northern Cape, the civil society organization Sake Liga is now bringing a court case for a similar action to be taken in that part of the world. In Mpumalanga, the High Court has ordered that the Lekwa municipality must hand their power over to the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni. So we now have a situation where Tito is not just the Minister of Finance of South Africa; he's also the city manager responsible for Lekwa, and is busy sorting it out. That court action was brought by a big company, Astral Foods, whom, as you know, is listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. They've got operations in that town, and the operations have been very, very negatively affected. And the court said this can't carry on. Cabinet has also decided that the council will be dissolved on the 12th of May, and that's the kind of consequences management that you want to see. So I point out to these developments taking place to illustrate the point that it is not just a stagnant situation. It's a very, very terrible situation. Yes, on that we all agree. So let's look for what fills the void. What is the counteraction that brings a different kind of behavior? And I think it's also important to remember that most of the country's GDP is produced in councils that are moving along, even if not optimally so. There are 278 local governments in South Africa, and according to the Department of Finance, 163 of them are in financial distress. That's 58%. That's a lot. It's a majority. But in the remaining 42%, I think is where you find a huge portion of the country's economic activity, and that is the core we must protect while you work on expanding and building better municipalities in other areas. Then the last area on which we got a lot of questions was the salary negotiations for the civil service and fiscal policy. Well, as you know, in 2020, the government has held the line very firmly on salary increases, and there were no increases granted last year. Although the Minister of Finance did budget for 1.5%, not even the 1.5% was given. So a lot of money was saved. That decision by the government was challenged in court, but as you know, the High Court has agreed with the government. At least it illustrates a government did their homework when they took the decision. It is true that that decision is now under appeal, and we'll have to see what the Constitutional Court says. They're repeating it all the way there, and one must abide by whatever the court rules. But certainly so far, government has illustrated a strong political will to curb salaries and to do something to bring it down. Negotiations are now going on for 2021, and we will see what comes out. The dispute has been declared. The one section of the civil service, the Public Service Association, they represent about 42–43% of civil servants have already said they're not interested in talking anymore, and they threatened to strike. But that's 235,000 people only. COSATU, which is the majority union in the civil service, is still talking, and it'll be interesting to see whether they also join the decision to strike. We'll just have to wait for this one to play out, but it's quite clear where government stands. On fiscal policy in general, we've got 5 months of the year behind us, and thanks to mining and agriculture, the budget numbers are coming in much, much better than what we predicted with the annual budget in February. So consequently, the deficit is smaller. And that helps us another little stepping stone in getting back to fiscal probity. As you know, the current budget provides that in 2.5 years' time, the primary deficit will sit at just under 1% of GDP. At the moment, it's of course considerably more. So it tells you where government wants to go. It tells you in which direction they're pushing the budgets. And make no mistake, there's a lot of austerity going around. And there's a lot of institutions not getting the money that they would have liked to get. But that is what has to happen. And I think once again, what we see is a strong political will. In Parliament recently, when the budget was passed, the Minister of Finance said the expenditure ceiling is sacrosanct. Within the ceiling, things can be moved around and money can be reallocated and so on and so forth. The jargon word is being used as reprioritized, but the ceiling itself is sacrosanct. Now, look back on the track record of government, and what you see is over the last couple of years, indeed, that ceiling has not been breached. Never. There may have been silly decisions inside the ceiling, like giving money to SAA, but the ceiling was not breached. There's no reason to think that it will be breached in the next 2 or 2.5 years. So, with the stronger growth that we're seeing in the economy, with the structural reform that we're seeing in the economy, particularly on electricity, spectrum, and infrastructure, we should see higher growth in continuing in 2022 and 2023. And of course, that's the best way to deal with a fiscal cliff and with debt. You must just grow faster, getting richer, then it becomes easier to balance the books and bring those ratios down. Thank you very much.